Today on ADG Pro, we're going back to an old isometric action puzzle game that I haven't touched in over a decade now, known as Mystic Towers, to answer a question I've always had about it. Just how good are the different attack magic spells, and how does any of that translate into enemy hit points? Well, that was the plan, but alas, this game had the last laugh, as I was unfortunately not able to dial in the numbers as accurately as I would have liked. I was able to eventually come up with rough estimates, but nothing more precise. One of the main issues I ran into right away is that the game runs at very bizarre frame rates. Now I know it doesn't look it, but trust me, I went so far as to counting hundreds of real frames compared to the game update frames to confirm my results. Though I only went that far for the default speed of the game. The game can actually run at 5 different speed settings, which you can adjust with the plus or minus keys. In fact, here's a comparison of how fast each of these game speeds are. If we consider the default speed to be 100%, the two faster speeds turn out to be 150% and 300%, which is kind of fast, while the two slower speeds are 75% and 60%. The problem, though, is that while the game is timed to individual frames of gameplay, the rate is not internally processed as frames per second. Rather, instead, it's processed as seconds per frame, as the seconds per frame the game runs at for its default speed is 0.06, which is 16.6 repeating frames per second. Not exactly a normal frame rate, to be sure. Now you might be thinking that this isn't really that relevant in terms of measuring the spell damage rates, except for one little factor that's easily missed. All of the monsters in the game are constantly regenerating hit points. This means that in order to determine just how much damage the spells are doing, given that we don't have any numerical representations for this anywhere, we first have to figure out how fast the rate of regeneration is, see if it conforms to any sort of number which aligns nicely with the weird 16.6 repeating frame rate, and then use that as our baseline as we try to figure out everything else. So the first check I made was to see how regeneration was applied in general just by watching monsters regenerate their hit points and counting the frames needed, and it turns out that no matter how many hit points a monster started with, it always regenerates at the same fixed rate, not a relative one. So that greatly simplifies a number of things. But I also noticed that monsters do not regenerate all the way back up to where they started, though they get really close, suggesting that the check for when to stop regenerating hit points is just simply inaccurate. Next, what I did was damage a monster down to a very low level of hit points, waited until a single pixel of hit points was regenerated, then measured how many game frames it took to regenerate one more pixel of health, then tried to see if that number conformed to any useful metric, which it did. And thus the best estimate I was able to make is that each pixel of health on the monster health gauge is equal to 240 hit points. And since a full bar of monster health is 28 pixels tall, this would mean the theoretical maximum amount of hit points a monster could have would be 6,720. Granted, that's for the monsters. I kinda wanted to know how this translated to the player health, since our main protagonist here, Baron Baldric, has a much larger health gauge, but it clearly doesn't work the same. The trick here was to find some manner of being able to damage the monsters, which also could damage the player, and thankfully, such things do exist in the form of bomb traps. Sometimes you'll see a very tiny dot on a floor tile, which indicates the presence of a bomb trap. If you walk over the dot, the bomb falls. So long as you keep walking straight and don't stop, the bomb will miss you, but if we allow ourselves to deliberately get hit by a bomb, it takes off exactly half of the player's health gauge. If we then go and dupe a monster with a lot of health into getting hit by such a bomb, we see that it takes away 8 pixels of its health, keeping in mind that the subunits for each pixel are rounded up. Thus, the minimum amount of damage the bomb does is 1,920 hit points. But since it did exactly half damage to the player, I think the safer assumption is that the bombs are doing exactly 2,000 hit points damage, in which case it would mean that Baron Baldric here has 4,000 hit points. Now that said, I didn't get too crazy doing investigations into the player hit points because, unfortunately, there's a massive delay between player hit point updates, as the player's health gauge only gets updated about once every 3/4 of a second. So that's not ideal given how rapidly the monsters can attack you. So instead, we're going to keep focusing on the spells versus the monsters. This is where things started to go sour though, since monsters don't necessarily start with exact multiples of 240 hit points. In fact, when you kill a monster, the amount of points it gives you is based on its health to some degree, with a fixed quantity of points applied as well, depending on which tower you're in, as the later towers and wizard towers have bigger fixed portions of the monster scores. But unfortunately, I wasn't able to figure out how this was being calculated, especially given that the numbers are frequently very unusual. Although I did notice that the difference in score values between all monsters in the same tower were always multiples of 5, even if the score awarded itself was not, suggesting some level of coarse granularity in terms of how many hit points the monsters could have. I did also notice too that the way monster hit points are calculated is pretty straightforward, even if I couldn't figure out the exact math involved. Each monster has a base number of hit points, and each floor of each tower has a bonus quantity of hit points added to that. Thus, if you fight a particular monster on a particular floor of a particular tower, it will always have that same quantity of hit points on that same floor of that same tower. Now, I had two possible methods lined up to try and figure out the amount of damage the spells were doing, but either was going to be exceptionally difficult to attempt without some manner of cheating. Now, thankfully, Mystic Towers has a very simple and very powerful cheat mode in it. To enable cheats, you simply type in Baldric on your keyboard mid-game. This will play a sound effect, which then enables all cheat keys. From here, holding Shift and pressing specific letters on the keyboard will do some fun things. Shift K will give you all of the keys, Shift W will give you 30 shots of all spells, Shift H restores your health, food, and water levels to maximum, Shift C sets your coin count to 10, but most pertinently, Shift R lets you then punch in two numbers to indicate which of the 45 rooms in the tower you want to teleport into. Using the teleportation cheat allowed me to find good rooms for doing a bunch of other tests, not just with the attack spells. For instance, one of the transmute niches in the game is found in room number 7 of Rim Fortress, the first wizard tower. And by using the coins cheat, I was able to figure out that the way spell maximums work in the game is not as forgiving as I thought it was. Each attack spell actually has a hard limit on how many shots you can carry. Sulfur caps at 50, Venom Cloud caps at 40, Fireball caps at 30, and Lightning caps at 20. And if you try to pick up any spell stack which would cause your own spell stocks to exceed those limits, it won't let you. This is especially important in the case of Lightning, since the transmute niche allows any stack to go up to 30, meaning if you put a stack of 20 lightning down, transmute it to get one more shot than that 20, and then try to pick it up, you will never again be able to, meaning you'll have lost all of your lightning spell shots. Now granted, that's only for the attack spells. For the 4 utility spells, not counting the bomb spells since it can't be transmuted, I was able to exceed 30 shots by using the game's pull command to pull stacks of 30 from the niche, and then put my empty stack in there to get even more shots, and discovered through this process that the utility spells are not actually capped. Yeah, if you exceed 99 shots in a utility spell, it kind of messes up the spell shot gauge, since it was never intended to show that many shots of a spell at a time. Also, one other quick little tangent before we get to the actual results of the spell damage testing. I've been doing all of this testing in the game's practice mode, which allows selecting any of the 12 towers in the game to play anytime you want, though you only get 1 extra life and you don't make any story progress when you do it this way. However, something I noticed is that every tower has its own unique description show up in the little text ticker at the bottom of the screen, which also points out the names of all of the different monsters present. Now granted, it doesn't help you figure out which names belong to which monsters, but hey, at least they're there. Anyways, enough screwing around, let's get to the spell damage calculations. The simpler method I came up with was to drain a monster's health to some extent, watch for a pixel of its health to regenerate, and mark that point in the footage, hit it with the spell I wanted to test, then measure how long it took for that same pixel of health to show up again. This method was really simple to execute, but unfortunately hit a major snag. I said earlier that monsters are constantly regenerating health, except is not actually constant, it's simply happening at regular intervals. I wasn't able to tell what the intervals were, but I believe the regeneration interval was 120 hit points for every 120 game frames. So yeah, the level of granularity that's going on here wasn't going to cut it for measuring the spell damage in this manner. My other option was a bit more involved and led to inconsistent results, which I couldn't narrow down, specifically because some of the numbers it came up with seemed to contradict the level of granularity I measured for the regeneration rate. But at least the results did verify the relative effectiveness of everything to a rough degree. So yeah, I don't have exact results to show for any of this, despite being fairly certain on the hit point numbers. But hey, rough approximations are better than nothing. So what I did was to first find a monster that wasn't too much of a chore to take out, but which had tons of hit points, yet would lose a single pixel of health immediately after just one shot of the ice spell, as this would indicate that the monster's health aligned very closely to the granularity of the health gauge. I ultimately decided to go with a flying insect of sorts, patrolling the area near room number 24 in Marchwall Hold, the final apprentice tower. You see, monsters in this game have assigned rooms they're allowed to travel between. If you see the monster indicator in the corner light up, but don't see the monster in the room you're in, this means you're in the monster's assigned patrol area, meaning that monster can enter the room at a moment's notice from a nearby room, but no other monsters are able to enter another monster's patrol area. Next, I just loaded up the spell I intended to test and marked the very first frame in my captured footage where the spell impacted and caused damage. I continued casting spells and dealing damage, and then ultimately marked the final frame where the spell finally killed the monster. I then measured the number of game frames between these 2 points to determine how many hit points were regenerated in that span of time, taking my estimated regeneration granularity into account, compared that versus the number of successful shots it took to take down the monster, and that gave me a very rough estimate on the damage dealt per shot. And again, there was no good way to narrow this down given that it's impossible to know exactly how much health every monster was starting with, nor where the regeneration timer was exactly at. To that end, using the ice spell as the baseline, the sulfur spell is roughly equal to 2 casts of the ice spell, the venom cloud spell is equal to roughly 2 casts of the sulfur spell, the fireball spell is equal to roughly 3 casts of the sulfur spell, and the lightning spell is equal to roughly 2 casts of the venom cloud spell. This makes our damage rates roughly 1x, 2x, 4x, 6x, and 8x. But again, these are very rough estimates. I believe the ice spell does 90 hit points damage, as this was the most consistent result by far, but the rest of the spells were horribly inconsistent, which may actually suggest some level of randomness might be a factor, in which case, we may never know how much damage the spells actually do. However, these results did lead me to one final thing of note, going right back around to the transmute niches. The Sulfur and Venom Cloud spells each only cost a single coin to transmute for an extra shot, whereas all other spells cost 2 coins to transmute. By this logic, and compared to the rough damage estimates we uncovered, it makes absolutely no sense whatsoever to ever spend money transmuting the Fireball spell. Fireball costs 2 coins to transmute, but is only 50% more effective than the Venom Cloud spell, which costs 1 coin, meaning you get more damage per cash spent on Venom Cloud than on Fireball. Granted, Lightning remains the better choice than either of those, since it's roughly the same damage per cash spent as Venom Cloud, but dishes out that damage twice as fast, so long as your aim is true. Anywho, I think we've tackled this about as well as possible considering the difficulties the game presented in trying to measure everything. And since my results with the more powerful spells was not consistent and actually contradicted itself, it stands to reason that the spells do have some level of randomness applied in regards to how much damage they do. And because of how long these measurements took, I didn't feel like spending hours on end trying to figure out the exact numbers by recording and measuring the same things dozens of times over. Especially considering that, well, it's kinda unnecessary. Because of how spells and damage and such works in Mystic Towers, there's rarely a good reason to use anything but your strongest spells at all times, seeing as the longer you let a tower stew for, the more monsters are going to get respawned, thus you want to take out the monsters as fast as you can. Now even the game knows this, as anytime you run out of shots for a particular attack spell, it automatically selects the next spell down the chain which you have shots for. And still, having these rough estimates on hand is definitely helpful in terms of understanding how quickly combat will go, and it also goes to show just how incredibly weak the Sulfur and especially the Ice spells are compared to the other 3 attack spells. Though I guess one reason to go with weaker attack magic would be if you were about to pick up a bunch more lying around, but there's otherwise never a reason to attack with anything but your strongest spells. So that'll be all for today's ADG Pro video. Next up, 2 Saturdays from now on June 17th will be a standard review, episode 314, where we're going to be taking a look at one of the weirdest flight sims ever made. Yeah, definitely stay tuned if you want to see how this crazy thing unfolds. Thanks for watching, everyone, and extra special thanks to everyone supporting me on Patreon. If you'd like to join the ranks of everyone you see here supporting the show directly, head on over to patreon.com/KASICK.
Practice mode.